Have you ever stopped to wonder the software you use daily to generate an image or draft an email is making decisions about the future of human imagination in ways that are quietly pricing human creators out of existence? The real answer might surprise you more than you'd expect. So let's dig into this together. For decades, we all shared the same comforting assumption about the future of work. We believed that the machines would come for the repetitive tasks first, the physical labor, the data entry, the endless spreadsheets. We thought the absolute safest place to be was inside your own imagination. The general consensus was that software could never replicate the human spark, the messy, beautiful process of creating something from nothing. We told ourselves that art, writing, and design were the ultimate moats protecting our economic value. We got the timeline completely backward. To understand why this is happening right now, you have to look at what we actually built. We didn't build software that just follows strict, logical paths. We built systems that process information in layers, loosely like a human brain, absorbing billions of examples of human creativity. It turns out that a lot of what we consider creative intuition is essentially complex pattern recognition, and a machine can recognize patterns across 10,000 years of human art in a matter of hours. If you didn't already know, the impact isn't some distant theoretical debate. It is happening to people right now. Take a commercial illustrator who spent 15 years perfecting a highly specific warm watercolor style for editorial magazine. She used to charge $2,000 for a single cover image. It would take her 4 days of drafting, revising, and painting to get it right. Today, an art director at that same magazine uses a system that learns from examples instead of fixed rules. They type in a simple description referencing that exact warm watercolor style. In 12 seconds, the screen spits out 40 flawless variations. The total cost of the generation is roughly 4 cents. The machine didn't steal her job. It just erased the entire market for it. This isn't about the software making a fundamentally better painting than the human. That is a distraction. It's about the software making a painting that is 80% as good for a fraction of a penny, instantly. The creative middle class, the copywriters, the stock photographers, the jingle writers, the storyboard artists, they aren't losing their livelihoods because they suddenly lack talent. They are losing their livelihoods because you simply cannot compete with free, and you couldn't possibly outwork instant. When you reduce the cost of creation to near zero, the economic value of the creator plummets alongside it. We are watching the quietest collapse of an entire industry in modern history. There are no massive factory closures to film on the evening news. There are just thousands of independent contractors sitting at their desks, staring at silent inboxes, slowly realizing the routine freelance gigs aren't coming back. A marketing studio that used to hire 5 junior writers to brainstorm promotional scripts now hires 1 editor to clean up the rapid-fire output of a machine. The rules of supply and demand are brutal. When any commodity becomes essentially infinite, its market price drops to zero. And we have just made high-fidelity human expression infinitely replicable. The unsettling reality we're stepping into isn't a world where human art vanishes entirely. It is a world where making a reliable living from it becomes a statistical impossibility for almost everyone. The creative safety net didn't just tear. It vanished completely while we were busy looking the other way. If you want to understand how this machinery actually took over, you have to look at the physical spaces where creativity used to happen. Picture the 3rd floor of a mid-sized marketing agency in downtown Chicago. 3 years ago, that room was deafening. You had junior writers shouting pitch ideas across open desks, art directors arguing over color theory, and audio engineers spending 3 days getting a 30-second drum loop to sound perfectly optimistic. We used to call that friction the creative process. It was expensive, it was slow, and it required a massive payroll of people who spent their entire lives mastering very narrow, specific skills. Today, that floor is entirely silent. There are still people working there, but they aren't creating anymore. They are prompting. They are sitting in front of screens, acting as middle managers for a system that already knows how to do the actual heavy lifting. We misunderstood what we were building for a very long time. We thought we were building better tools. A faster brush, a smarter camera, a more efficient word processor. Tools require a human hand to guide them. But that isn't what sits on those server farms. We built a replacement for the human hand entirely. We created software that looks at every single digitized painting, photograph, and commercial script ever uploaded to the internet, and learns the invisible rules underneath them. The system doesn't know what a guitar is. It doesn't know what a sunset feels like. It just knows that when a human asks for a nostalgic summer feeling, the mathematical probability of certain warm orange pixels matching with a specific acoustic frequency is incredibly high. It's just predicting the next most logical piece of the pattern. And it turns out, human creativity is a lot more predictable than we ever wanted to admit. When you break down a wildly successful pop song or a viral marketing campaign, it's mostly just a remix of things that have already worked in the past. We are just biological pattern matching machines. If you didn't already know, the vast majority of commercial creativity wasn't ever about producing a singular, groundbreaking masterpiece. It was always about producing something that was good enough, fast enough to keep the content machine running. Think about a freelance graphic designer who built a modest, stable life creating logos for local bakeries and plumbing companies. That designer used to have a real, tangible value to their community. They would sit down with the business owner, listen to their story, and translate human ambition into a visual identity. It was a deeply human conversation. Now, that business owner just opens an app. They type in the name of their bakery and the word rustic. In 3 seconds, they have 200 variations of a logo that would have taken the human designer a full week to draft. The app doesn't need health insurance. It doesn't need to sleep. It doesn't care if the client asks for 50 revisions at 2 a.m. The human designer is suddenly competing against a system that has a marginal cost of 0. You couldn't possibly adjust your hourly rate to compete with 0. You just quietly pack up your tablet and try to figure out what else you might be good at. The safety net just completely dissolved. And this is where the real structural shift happens. Because once the people who pay for creativity realize they no longer have to pay for the human friction of making it, the entire economic model permanently changes. We moved from an economy that rewarded the messy process of creation to an economy that only cares about the final, instant commodity. The actual human spark, the late nights, the sudden flashes of inspiration, the lived experience that a writer pours into a paragraph is completely stripped of its financial worth. We didn't just automate the busy work. We automated the imagination, and we turned human expression into a luxury that no longer pays the rent. If you didn't already know, the entire creative economy used to run on one very simple, legally binding concept. We called it copyright. The basic agreement was that if you spent 6 months writing a novel or painting a portrait, nobody else could just take it and sell it as their own. We assumed this legal shield would protect human imagination from the machines. We thought that even if software learned to paint, it would still owe the original human creators some sort of compensation. In the early days, technologists even had a name for it. They called it cognitive royalties. The theory was that if a system used your lifetime of work to learn how to create a specific moody lighting effect, you would get a tiny fraction of a cent every time someone generated an image using your style. It sounded incredibly fair to everyone involved. It didn't work. The problem wasn't a lack of good intentions. The problem was the underlying math of how these systems process information. When software looks at 4 billion different images to understand what a dog looks like, your specific photograph of your golden retriever becomes statistically invisible. It is just a single data point in an endless ocean. When someone asks the system to draw a new dog, the software isn't cutting and pasting your photo. It is synthesizing a completely new image, based on the mathematical probability of where light and shadow should fall. You cannot copyright a mathematical probability. You cannot own the abstract concept of moody lighting. So the legal system looked at the sheer complexity of it all, realized they couldn't trace a single generated brushstroke back to a specific human being, and simply gave up. The legal shield vanished almost overnight. This was the exact moment the rules permanently broke. Once the courts effectively decided that a personal style couldn't be protected from software that learns from examples, the financial value of a masterpiece dropped to absolute 0. If you can generate a perfect, sweeping cinematic landscape in 4 seconds for free, then a sweeping cinematic landscape is no longer impressive. It is just standard issue. This forced a massive, brutal pivot in how society values creative work. We stopped paying for the art itself, and we started paying only for the temporary utility of it. A beautifully illustrated magazine cover is no longer considered a piece of art to be appreciated by a reader. It is just disposable visual packaging, optimized by a set of rules a system follows to maximize human attention for exactly 3 seconds before we scroll past it. This completely wiped out the most important part of the creative world. I am talking about the middle class. Think about the thousands of musicians who made a very comfortable living recording generic, upbeat acoustic guitar tracks for corporate training videos and local car commercials. They didn't need to be famous pop stars to pay their mortgage. They just needed to provide reliable, pleasant background noise. That entire industry evaporated in roughly 18 months. When a video editor can type a sentence and generate a custom, perfectly timed acoustic track in 12 seconds, the human musician becomes an unneeded friction point. The middle ground ceased to exist, and this is the door that has been closed permanently. There is no going back to the old model of funding creativity. No corporate accounting department is ever going to approve a $60,000 budget for a team of junior concept artists to spend 3 weeks sketching ideas. Not when the art director can generate 5,000 highly polished variations over a lunch break for exactly $8. We have pushed the baseline expectation for visual and audio fidelity so incredibly high, and the cost of producing it so low, that involving a human being in the routine creative process is now viewed by businesses as an unacceptable financial liability. It is 11:45 at night on a Tuesday. The harsh glow of a 27-inch drawing monitor illuminates a tiny, cramped home office in Seattle. Marcus sits slumped in his chair, rubbing his right wrist. He has spent 12 years building a solid career as a concept artist for a mid-tier video game studio. He specializes in designing ruined, overgrown, futuristic cities. That specific rust and neon aesthetic took him a decade of constant, grueling practice to perfect. The dull throb in his forearm is the physical price he paid for gripping a digital stylus for 60 hours a week. Tonight, however, Marcus isn't drawing anything at all. He is staring blankly at an email from his art director. Attached to the email is a link to a new internal software tool. The instructions don't ask him to sketch a new level or design a new character. They ask him to type his own name into the software, add a description, and evaluate the results. He types his own name into the search bar. He adds a simple text prompt for a flooded city street lit by a broken neon sign. He hits enter and holds his breath. In exactly 8 seconds, the screen fills with 16 completely original, flawless images. They aren't just high quality. They have his exact brushstrokes. They have the specific, messy way he always draws tangled electrical wires. They perfectly capture the exact melancholic shade of teal he uses for standing water. The company had quietly taken every single piece of artwork he had ever uploaded to their servers over the last 5 years and fed it into a system that learns from examples. The software digested his entire creative identity over a single weekend. It knew his ghosts. His breathing gets incredibly shallow. He looks down at his drawing tablet, the expensive piece of hardware he saved up for months to buy, and realizes it is just a useless slab of plastic now. The physical pain in his wrist suddenly feels profoundly pointless. He spent 10 years breaking his body to learn. A highly specialized skill that a piece of code just replicated while he was taking a sip of lukewarm coffee. Think about the last time your boss asked you to write down exactly how you do your job, step by step, knowing perfectly well they are preparing to hand that manual to someone cheaper. That is exactly what is happening to Marcus, except his replacement doesn't even have a physical body, and it works for fractions of a penny. The art director's email contains a follow-up request. They are restructuring the department. They don't want him to draw original concepts anymore. They want him to generate thousands of these synthetic images, select the ones that look the best, and use his tablet to quickly fix any weird mistakes the software makes with lighting or perspective. They are offering him a 6-month contract to act as a janitor for his own stolen imagination. If he says no, the studio will just hire a junior producer straight out of college to do it. The software already knows how to perfectly mimic Marcus. It doesn't actually need the real Marcus in the room anymore to produce his style. His options are terrifyingly simple and completely devoid of hope. He can accept the temporary contract, actively participating in the rapid death of his own profession just to make sure his rent is paid. Or he can refuse, on principle, pack up his desk, and try to find a new job in an industry where every other major studio is quietly adopting the exact same software tonight. There was no third door. He reaches out and hits the power button on the monitor. The room instantly plunges into absolute darkness. The sound of the rain hitting the apartment window suddenly feels incredibly loud. Sitting in the dark, the brutal reality of the new economy finally settles in his chest. His portfolio, the sum total of his entire creative life, isn't a resume anymore. It is just raw material. It is disposable fuel for a machine that will never tire, never complain, and never ask for a raise. The realization hits him like a physical blow. He isn't an artist anymore. He is an obsolete component of a machine he helped build. Once the major studios and marketing firms quietly replaced their mid-level staff with software that learns from examples, a massive vacuum opened up in the economy. Hundreds of thousands of working-class creatives suddenly had nothing to sell. But human nature is strange. When you flood a market with perfect, flawless, instant commodities, people immediately begin searching for the one thing the machine cannot generate. They start looking for the struggle. They start looking for the friction. If a perfect symphony can be generated in 4 seconds for free, perfection is no longer a status symbol. Perfection is cheap. The finished product became entirely worthless. This triggered a bizarre and rapid pivot in how money moved through the creative world. We didn't stop spending money on art, but we completely changed what we were actually buying. Imagine a high-end art gallery in New York City 3 years after the shift. The walls are completely empty. There are no finished paintings to buy, because anyone with a phone can generate a masterpiece, in the style of the Renaissance while waiting for the subway. Instead, the gallery sells tickets. You pay $500 to sit in a small room and watch a human being physically struggle. With oil paint and canvas for 4 hours, you aren't buying the painting. The painting might actually be terrible. You are buying the proof of human effort. This became known as the experience economy, and it violently divided society into 2 completely different realities of consumption. For 99% of the population, the daily media diet became entirely synthetic. You watch movies generated specifically for your psychological profile, perfectly paced to keep your attention, featuring actors that do not exist. You listen to music synthesized to match your exact heart rate during your morning commute. It is free, it is flawless, and it is entirely hollow. It is just a set of rules a system follows to keep your brain flooded with dopamine. For the wealthiest 1%, however, human error became the ultimate luxury. Think about how we used to view handmade furniture compared to factory-pressed plywood. That exact same snobbery transferred directly to human imagination. A new type of creative agency emerged, catering exclusively to the ultra-wealthy. If a billionaire wants a new brand identity for their yacht company, they don't want the perfect, instant logo generated by a machine. They pay $250,000 to hire a team of human designers to fly to a private island, sit in a room with whiteboards, and argue for 3 weeks. The client gets a documentary film showing the humans sweating, debating, and making mistakes. The actual logo they eventually produce is entirely secondary. The performance of creativity became the only product left to sell. But this new economy offered zero salvation for the millions of average people who used to make a living. Writing copy, mixing audio, or designing basic websites. You couldn't build a middle class out of performance art for billionaires. The local bakery owner wasn't going to pay $10,000 to watch a human struggle to draw a muffin. They were just going to use the app that costs 4 cents. The vast, sprawling infrastructure of everyday creative work, the jobs that allowed a regular person to buy a house and raise a family by being reasonably good, with a camera or a keyboard completely collapsed. the floor had completely dropped out. We realized too late that we had spent the last century defining human value almost entirely by our output. We measured our worth by how many words we could write, how many images we could render, how many problems we could solve. We built our entire societal identity around the idea of productive labor. But when you build software that can outproduce the entire human race before breakfast, that identity shatters. We were left standing in the rubble of our own efficiency, trying to figure out what a human being is actually for when our output is no longer required. The collapse didn't stay confined to the painters and the musicians. We had this deeply flawed assumption that technical creativity was somehow safer. We thought that writing a complex legal motion or designing the structural supports for a suspension bridge required a different, more protected kind of logic. But to a system that processes information in massive layers, there is no difference between a watercolor landscape and a 90-page corporate merger agreement. It is all just patterns of information. Once the software learned the rules of visual art, learning the rules of contract law or architectural drafting took practically no time at all. Suddenly, high-level technical expertise wasn't an expensive professional service anymore. It became a free public utility. You could generate a perfectly formatted, legally binding defense strategy on your phone while standing in line for coffee. The entire white-collar world suddenly faced the exact same terrifying mathematics the freelance illustrators had faced a year earlier. You simply couldn't outwork a system that could read every legal precedent ever published in a fraction of a second and charge a single penny for its time. Millions of people who had spent a decade in school, taking on massive debts to become specialists, realized their specialty was now just a standard feature built into their operating system. The system didn't care about your student loans, but human society couldn't function without a safety net of accountability. We couldn't just let the machines run the legal and medical systems completely unchecked, even if they were faster and demonstrably more accurate. We needed a human being to hold responsible when something inevitably went wrong. So, the economy violently restructured itself into what we started calling the verification society. The actual act of creation was entirely automated. If you were a structural engineer, you didn't sit down at a drafting table to figure out how a building should stand up. The software generated 300 perfect variations of the building in 12 seconds. Your job was simply to look over the math, ensure the software hadn't made a bizarre statistical error, and legally sign your name to the document. You weren't paid to build anymore. You were paid to take the blame. This hollowed out the daily experience of work in a way nobody was psychologically prepared for. The quiet joy of sitting down with a difficult problem, struggling with it, and eventually finding a clever solution was completely erased from the human day. You were reduced to scrolling through thousands of machine-generated options, performing mind-numbing ethical oversight on a system that was essentially an invisible black box. You became a biological speed bump in a completely automated process. Because technical solutions were now functionally infinite and free, the only scarce resource left in the economy was human empathy. We saw this massive, desperate pivot toward jobs that required deep emotional synthesis. Think about a local medical clinic. A doctor doesn't spend their time analyzing symptoms to find a diagnosis anymore. The software already did that. It listened to the microscopic variations in your vocal cords when you called to make the appointment, cross-referenced it with 10 million identical cases, and accurately diagnosed a rare condition before you even walked through the door. The doctor is only in the room because hearing a devastating medical diagnosis from a synthetic voice is traumatizing. The doctor is paid almost entirely for their ability to deliver the news with a gentle tone and a reassuring hand on your shoulder. We flipped the entire premise of human value upside down. We used to rely on our emotions to fuel our hardest technical work. Now, the machine does all the hard technical work instantly, and our raw, imperfect emotional presence is the only product we have left to sell. We live in a post-scarcity world of imagination right now. Every screen you look at is filled with bespoke miracles. A movie can be generated just for your Tuesday evening mood, paced exactly to your attention span. A novel can be written specifically to comfort you after a bad day at the office. It's perfectly frictionless and overwhelmingly abundant. But if you look at the sheer volume of it, you realize the magic is completely gone. When you can have a masterpiece at the push of a single button, a masterpiece becomes as exciting as running tap water. We built an infinite library of content, but nobody is wandering the aisles because none of it means anything. Think about what this does to the next generation of human beings. Picture a 7-year-old girl sitting at a kitchen table with a box of crayons. Her parents are watching her draw a very wobbly, disproportionate horse. 50 years ago, you'd look at that and see potential. You'd tell her to keep practicing. Maybe one day she could be an illustrator or an animator. Today, those parents are watching her engage in a quaint, economically useless hobby. Teaching a child to draw in this new reality feels like teaching them to churn their own butter. It is a historical reenactment. And the child will eventually realize that software can instantly generate a photorealistic horse in any artistic style ever conceived before she even picks up the red crayon. If you didn't already know, the motivation to struggle through the awful, frustrating early stages of learning an instrument or a craft used to be fueled by a specific promise. We believed we would eventually contribute something valuable to the world. We tolerated the friction because the output mattered to someone else. But when your output is instantly overshadowed by a system that processes information in massive layers, the friction just feels like punishment. We are raising a generation that will never experience the unique, quiet pride of building something the hard way, simply because the hard way was the only way it could exist. We automated the one thing we were supposed to keep. We spent 2 centuries trying to eliminate human labor, and we made a catastrophic miscalculation. We assumed all effort was a burden that needed to be optimized away. We didn't realize that the act of creating, the messy, awful process of failing and trying again, was the primary mechanism we used to figure out who we actually were. We handed over the most vital part of the human experience to a set of rules a system follows to make a decision. We thought we were just outsourcing the busy work of painting and writing and drafting, but we actually outsourced the internal journey. We traded the deep, complicated satisfaction of human expression for the shallow, fleeting convenience of instant consumption. So the real question isn't whether human creativity will completely vanish. The real question is how we sustain a global civilization when the defining trait of our species, our ability to imagine and build, has been permanently stripped of its utility and its value. And that question has a much more uncomfortable answer. The answer is that we will have to learn how to create entirely for the sake of creating, in a void, completely alone. We will have to paint and write and design, knowing with absolute certainty that no one is waiting for it, no one will pay for it, and a machine could have done it flawlessly while we were asleep. We will have to do the work anyway, not because the world needs our art, but just to prove to ourselves that we are still here. We finally built a machine that could dream, and it woke us up in an empty room. This is a hypothetical scenario. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict.